Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review video where I like to review and talk about some albums released earlier this year that for whatever reason I didn't have a chance to cover in full. You guys know the drill by this point, so I'm just going to get right into things here today with the first project that I want to talk about, the newest album from Hannah Diamond, Reflections. This is the debut album from Hannah Diamond, though she has been putting out some singles over the past few years or so. Many of those singles end up here on this new project, and overall, I think this is a pretty great pop album. The sound and style that is created here on this thing is one that is pretty unique in my opinion. It feels weirdly personal but distant at the same time, almost like the album is trying to invite you in to tell you, to show you really all these different stories and ideas present in the lyrics here on this project, but at the same time, it's trying its hardest to kind of keep you at a distance, and it tries its hardest to really make the more personal parts of this album feel inaccessible to anyone with emotion. And I mean this in a very good way. The mix of sounds and ideas on this thing is one that's very unique, and I haven't really heard anything quite like this album. The lyrics here on this project often go into stories of heartbreak and loneliness and things of that sort. However, like I said before, the presentation of these lyrics and the sound of this project as a whole is one that feels kind of distant from any immediate emotion. The whole sound of this thing is one that's pretty clear, pretty sterile, but in a way that actually sounds really interesting when paired up with some of the lyrics here on this thing. Hannah's vocals themselves oftentimes sound really clean. There's lots of vocal effects and manipulations put on them at times on this thing to make them sound even more distant from what is being talked about in the lyrics themselves. It's almost like the heartfelt lyrics here on this thing are being presented by some almost robotic, human-like creation thing instead of like an actual person, but it's this relationship that makes listening to this album as enjoyable as it is. Overall, I think the vocals here on this project sound really nice, and the way that they're presented, like I've been saying up to this point, is just really interesting in my opinion. The production here on this thing is also very clean, very clear, and once again, very just to the point with how it's done. Nothing is super muddy or anything. It matches up really nicely with the vocals and their delivery here, just being really clean, really pleasant to listen to too, very beautiful sounding. Occasionally on this thing you do get some moments in the vocals where it seems like this bridge between the emotional side of the lyrics and the presentation of them is kind of like breached in a sense, where some of the vocals just become a lot more impassioned, and it almost sounds like it's trying to break through that wall that this album almost creates between the listener and the deeper stuff being talked about on this thing. And the instrumentals sometimes do this as well. For example, on the track Concrete Angel, you have this really interesting beat switch up that comes on in the middle of the track. It's probably the best moment on the album in my opinion, just where this track kind of goes off the rails into this really cool new direction, and the instrumental just kind of shifts from being really beautiful and straightforward like a lot of the other instrumentals on this thing into this really wild and crazy sounding electronic instrumental that's unlike anything else on the project. Overall, it makes for probably my favorite song on the entire project. And when it comes to the hooks here on this album, they're also really catchy and memorable too. Through and through, this is a pretty, digestible pop record. A lot of its deeper, more nuanced attributes are, really things that you would more so pick up on if you wanted to, pay attention a bit more to the lyrics and what's actually being presented here. This album almost feels like Hannah's trying to take the concept of pop music, something that oftentimes is seen as being kind of hollow and vapid and just without much of a point, and kind of applying that aspect to it to something that is a bit more meaningful and just creating this really interesting relationship with it. And overall, I think it sounds pretty nice. When it comes to complaints with this project, I really don't have too many. There are maybe a couple tracks on this thing that aren't quite as interesting as some of the other ones here, but I don't think there's a bad cut on this thing either way. It's still, from start to finish, a pretty enjoyable experience. I do think for the most part every track here brings something new to the table, whether it be something different with the instrumentation, or the vocals and their delivery, or in the lyrics themselves and what's being discussed in the song. Another kind of complaint that I could see people having with this project is that a lot of the tracks from this thing have been released for quite a while now. Like I said before at the start of this video, some of the earliest songs that appear on this album have been released since as early as 2016. And if you've been a long-term fan of Hannah Diamond and her music, I could see you being kind of disappointed with what you get here, because a good amount of the songs here have been released for some time now. But as someone who has only really recently gotten into her music, which is why I'm covering this here in this segment as opposed to doing a full album review for it, in the case of me, I don't really have that problem because it's all, relatively new to me as I'm listening through this thing. But I could still understand if you had that problem with the album, because a lot of these songs have in fact been released for quite a while. But even still, I don't think that ruins the full product that you get here, because even though a lot of these songs have been released for a while, they come together still to make a pretty cohesive package, in my opinion. In fact, the fact that so many of these songs have been, slowly been released over the course of a few years now, and the fact that this is as cohesive as it is just really impressive, honestly. But overall, I think this is a really solid pop record if you're interested in this kind of music, and if you've liked some of the teaser tracks of this thing that have been released for a while now, then you should definitely give this album a listen, because it's pretty much just that, but in a full-length record. And like I said, I think the approach to pop that Hannah takes here on this album is really interesting, and if that sounds like something that's up your alley, you should certainly give it a listen. But yeah, overall, enjoyable record that I would certainly recommend. Moving on, sticking with the topic of pop music released earlier this year that I didn't have a chance to cover, I'm now going to talk about the new debut mixtape from Slayyyter, which is also self-titled. This came out earlier this year, though I didn't get around to listening to it fairly recently. And overall, I do think this is another enjoyable pop release from earlier this year. The sound of this thing is pretty much a throwback of sorts to some of the pop music that was pretty popular, I feel like, towards the end of the 2000s and the earliest parts of the 2010s, like that very electronic-influenced club styled, really energetic pop music. That's essentially what this mixtape is, but also with a little bit of that kind of more experimental electronic pop that's been popular in some circles for the past few years or so. It's kind of like a little bit of a marriage between the two sounds here on this thing, as the production here is somewhat experimental at times, a little bit glitchy, just a little bit noisier than maybe what you would have heard on the radio about a decade or so ago. But the mixture of sounds here is pretty nice, in my opinion. Through and through, I think this is a pretty fun pop mixtape. All of the tracks here on this album are pretty much just really catchy, really straightforward. The production is pretty fun and lively too. Like I said before, at times it does have a slightly, and I mean very slightly, kind of noisy experimental edge to it, though for the most part it is still really accessible. All of the tracks on this thing are also pretty short and to the point with their runtime, considering that, all the songs on this thing are pretty straightforward pop songs. I think that's a pretty good thing. And none of the individual tracks here really feel like they last too long, and that, they get to the point where they start to really lose steam or anything. All the songs taken by themselves are pretty enjoyable. One complaint that I do kind of have with the project as a whole, though, is the fact that I do feel like I wish that maybe that there were either a few less tracks on this thing overall, either that, or maybe there was a bit more diversity spread out across the different songs on this thing, as I do feel like even though every song on here is pretty enjoyable on its own to some extent, when you're listening through this thing as a whole, it does kind of start to lose steam towards the end, because pretty much every song you're getting here, for the most part, it follows a pretty similar basic format. They're all pretty straightforward, fun, energetic pop songs, really. And after a while, the songs are still good, they're still enjoyable, but they're just not as memorable towards the end of this thing, I feel, as they are at the start. I think maybe shortening the runtime of this thing overall a little bit could have helped prevent this, either that or, like I said before, maybe having a bit more diversity when it comes to the sound of some of these tracks, as for the most part, like I said, they all follow a pretty similar basic outline to them. Occasionally you do have some songs that are a little bit different, probably my favorite being the song Alone, which has a bit more of a slightly, menacing tone to it. It still does fit in really nicely with all the other songs on this thing, but it just stands out as being a bit more memorable overall. And again, it has a lot of what makes the other songs good. It has a really catchy hook to it. The production here is really fantastic too. Slayyyter herself brings a lot of energy to this song. but I just wish there was maybe a few more moments on the record that were maybe a little bit more adventurous. This isn't really a super big issue with the mixtape, though I still feel like through and through it's a pretty enjoyable project. Like I said, all the songs here are pretty straightforward, pretty fun. All the songs here are really catchy as well. I think Slayyyter brings a lot of energy to these songs and her performances on these things. It just comes together to be a pretty fun pop mixtape, and I'm interested to see what Slayyyter's going to do going forward, because I think that this is a really solid foundation as a first full-length project of hers. And I think that if she does kind of branch out a bit more, maybe try some more new things on her next full-length project, whatever that may be, I think that she can make some really interesting pop music going forward. But for right now, this is a fun tape. Definitely something I would recommend if you're a fan of this style of music. But yeah, overall, I would recommend this too. Moving on, the last project I'm going to be covering here today is the new collaborative album between Uncommon Nasa and Kount Fif, City as School. I was, pretty familiar with Uncommon Nasa's music prior to hearing this. I wasn't really super familiar with Kount Fif, but he handles the production here on this thing, and I was excited to see what this project had in store for it. Didn't quite get around to covering this in full when it initially dropped, because this came out during October, I believe it was, towards the end of that month, when there was just so much stuff dropping, and I didn't get around to listening to it until right now. But I did eventually, and I'm happy that I did, because overall this is a pretty enjoyable hip-hop record. I don't think it's one of Uncommon Nasa's best projects overall, but for any fans of hip-hop out there, this is still a project worth listening to. Pretty much all the tracks on this thing feature Uncommon Nasa doing some pretty fantastic rapping, as he typically does. His lyrics here on this project are also pretty great, essentially talking about his home city of New York City and his come up through that city, his just life living in the city many years ago. He's really just in a sort of reflective state here on this thing, and I think his lyrics here reflecting on this overall are pretty nice. There's also a couple of skits here on this thing where he and Fif are discussing kind of growing up in New York and what that sort of entailed, which are also pretty interesting. I think the skits here, they don't last too long to the point where they interrupt the flow of this thing, but I think with what they discuss, they add quite a lot to the overall meaning and themes of the project. Overall, I thought that they were pretty decent skits, and overall the lyricism here on this project is pretty tight. You do also get some pretty memorable hooks here on this thing, like on the tracks NYST or Artificial Times, for example. The flow of a lot of the songs here are also pretty enjoyable too. The production that Kount Fif provides here is pretty solid. It's an interesting mixture between some more synth-based sounds, some more organic live instrumentation kind of sounding moments, as well as some more typical classic hip-hop sounds too. The mix of these things works out pretty nicely in my opinion. A lot of the beats on this thing feel pretty lively and just very New York in nature too, which works out pretty nicely because, the whole project is kind of talking about New York, so that makes a lot of sense. And Uncommon Nasa does a really good job flowing over these beats too. It's just a pretty nice marriage between these two artists on this thing. You will also get a fair amount of featured artists on this thing too, pretty much all of which come in and do a pretty good job on whatever respective track they happen to appear on. They tend to have pretty good chemistry with Uncommon Nasa himself and the production that they happen to be flowing over. Really, the features here are just pretty solid through and through. My biggest complaint with this record overall is probably that there are a lot of moments here where this record just kind of feels a bit underwhelming in some regards, I guess. Like the impact that it's trying to have just doesn't get across to the full extent that I would hope it to, especially in some of these shorter cuts on this thing, which are still pretty enjoyable through and through. I don't think there's a bad track on this thing necessarily, but I do feel like some of the shorter cuts can be a bit more forgettable and a bit more uninteresting, especially towards the middle of this record. However, I do feel like the start of this project is pretty strong, and the end of this thing is probably the best part of the entire project, as you have tracks like Artificial Times and Best Laid Plans, which are two of my favorite cuts on this entire project, and they're also two of the beefier cuts when it comes to length on this thing too. And you have the track Clusters and Sunrise, which I also feel like are two of the more solid cuts on this thing as well. The end of this album certainly is a strong moment on this thing, and it's a good thing that this ends on a high point. But overall, I do feel like City as School is a pretty decent album from start to finish. Like I said, I don't think it's one of Uncommon Nasa's best releases or anything. I can't really compare this to anything else Kount Fif has done, because, like I said, I'm not super familiar with his work outside of this record, but to any fans of these two artists, I would have to recommend this album because even though there are some moments that could feel maybe a little underwhelming or that they don't really have the impact that I was hoping that they would, it's still an enjoyable listen through and through, and even the weakest moments on this thing are still pretty enjoyable, and they really don't bring down the flow or the quality of this album all too much. So yeah, if you're a hip-hop fan, especially of the artists involved with this thing, definitely give this album a listen. I would certainly recommend it. And with that said, that covers all the albums I wanted to talk about here today. Overall, it was a really solid collection of projects I got to talk about. I really enjoyed all three of these projects. I certainly recommend all three of these projects, especially if you're interested in the artists or the genres that they happen to be playing around in. But yeah, I'm pretty happy to have heard all three of these things. And this is probably going to be the last catch-up review that I do in 2019. So, yeah, overall it's been a pretty good year for music reviews. We're going to be moving into year-end lists soon, so make sure you stick around for those. And then, of course, 2020 comes along, more album reviews, and, of course, more catch-up reviews with that as well. And, yeah, that's really all I have to say on that. Thank you for watching this video. If you happen to really enjoy it, leave your thoughts on any of these three projects that you've heard in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Again, we're going to be doing year-end lists pretty soon, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see those too. And yeah, thanks for watching again, and stay golden.